Let us pray. Father, Son, Holy Ghost, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, Victor, Conqueror, Warrior, Jehovah of Hosts, the God of decrees and execution of decrees. Help our minds and our thoughts and our feelings. Give us attentiveness, retentiveness of memory. Give us insight into issues and attitudes. Help us to understand others and their souls. Help us to look into our own souls and lives by the light of thy grace and the light of Jesus shine. And where we err, O Lord, let us, help me take those things to the trash yard with all due speed and alacrity, and to trust again and anew, afresh and with power, nurtured by your Son, Jesus, our only advocate and mediator, Jesus. Amen. Well, we turn our attention back to Canon. Dixon, I wasn't real happy with his discussion of Latimer. It was a little bit too soft. A lot of questions that weren't answered. Now he's dealing with some of the parliamentary things of Mortmain and the supplication of the ordinaries. Here we are back at it again. Canon Dixon, History of the Reformation, History of the Church of England from the Abolition of the Roman Jurisdiction, Volume 1. This would tend to make the religious houses afraid of dealing out their lands to small tenants. And if, as is often said, land accumulated in Mortmain ever lay idle and unproductive, the evil must not be imputed to the religious bodies or them only, but to legislative interference in the natural devolution of properties. By another enactment of the same vigorous reign, it was ordained that no lands held in fee simple should come into Mortmain by sale or purchase. Disparities of legislation seem to forbid of religious establishments and to tie them up in withering fixity. They were, some of them, a part of the remarkable legislation of the greatest of the Edwards, by which much of the old system of tenures was done away, and among us the tenure Franco-Lemoyne. The last two mentioned enactments, however, seem to be at variance with the general spirit of his laws. But in the subsequent times of foreign and civil wars and troubles, all these careful provisions were eluded by the great extension which was given to the doctrine of uses. It was found that feudal holders were legally able to escape the ruinous fines, forfeitures, and exactions to which they were liable if they conveyed their estates to the nominal fiefs to the use of themselves and their heirs. But fiefments were judged good in law, and the fiefs were held to be bound to a use for the rents and emoluments of the estates through the seisin or actual possession. A distinction was thus made between the use and the possession, or rather a new kind of property was created. Although the age of the great growth of religious establishments was long past, yet the church and religion came in for their share of the advantages of this new practical manner of conveyance, and fiefments were made to their use, whether by pious laymen or perhaps more frequently by their own hands, by members of their own religious bodies. But in long time, the jealous spirit of the legislature was aroused again by their participation of the general benefit, and the statute of Richard II made it Mortmain to be besieged of lands to the use of religious or spiritual persons. None of these former statutes of Mortmain and uses was pretended that anything else was sought but the preservation of the rights and profits of the crown and great lords. Nor now, when the Parliament of Henry VIII undertook to add to the number of such statutes, was any other motive alleged. The king and the other lords and subjects of the realm, it was declared, suffered the same losses and inconveniences by reason of fiefments, fines, recoveries, and other assurances made to the use of parish churches, chapels, church wardens, guilds, and fraternities, as they would have suffered if the lands and tenements thus given had been alienated in Mortmain. Sometimes these dotations were made by common assessment of the people, without any corporation, sometimes with the intent to have obits perpetual, or a continual service of a priest forever, or for 60 or 80 years. Such was the way in which Henry and his Parliament opened their great attack upon corporate property, and more particularly upon the property of the religious bodies and the churches. From the language of the act, it would seem that the chantries, or lands devoted to obits, and the maintenance of priests to sing for the soul of the donor, were designed to have fallen first. And in truth, this act is the foundation of the subsequent distinction which arose between pious and superstitious uses. But as events turned out, the storm fell first upon the monasteries, and the chantries were left to the last ferocity of Henry and the destructive avarice of the following reign. For 2 centuries, the course of legislation had been against corporate property, although the founding of corporations and the favor shown them by earlier kings had created the people and the liberties of England. But none could now have foreseen the violence of the impending revolution, nor the rapidity and success with which it was to be carried. The success was great, but yet it was less than was intended. The religious establishments were swept away. The church was beggared. But the mighty revolution in which the first movement was now made rose at one time to menace every existing corporation in the realm. 23 Henry 10. The statute was followed by 27 Henry VIII. 27 would be 1536. For making persons who had only the use of their lands the actual possessors, which was as heavy a blow to the old system of tenure. This is the act to abolish annates. This is going to be another one, a biggie. It would seem again from the language used in the act that the old statutes of Mortmain had produced their full effect in checking the alienation of lands, while limiting usages had failed in their operation. But the complaint of the king and great lords was a mere pretext, and would have remained a mere pretext if the case had been reserved. Military service, the greatest of the feudal obligations, was becoming obsolete, being commuted for money payment. And with the feudal militia had disappeared the original mischief of Mortmain. As to the other feudal profits which may still have survived, they were not affected by trusts and uses. The fiefs who held lands to uses were the legal holders, and were bound by law to discharge whatever obligations might exist upon the lands which they held. They were only bound by secondary claims of equity. The new statute, devised under this pretense to put an end to the perpetuity of endowments, was the well-tuned prelude of spoliation. For the perpetuity of endowments has ever been the grievance of sacrilege. But the most celebrated enactment of the session was for the abolition of annates, or the first fruits of the bishoprics, paid on every vacancy of the apostolic see. As this measure, if it had been passed by Parliament and sanctioned by the king at once and without reserve, would have appeared to be an abrupt and decisive act of hostility to Rome, a remarkable degree of secrecy and caution was displayed in the management of it. It was conditional. The papal nuncio was unable to give his master an exact account of what was being transacted within the walls of Parliament. The bill remained unpublished for a year, a special clause being inserted that the royal assent might be delayed until the king had exhausted all efforts to bring the pope to a good understanding. Then only was it ratified and declared a statute by letters patent. In the term of the act themselves, the same caution was observed. Lords and Commons declared indeed that they were no longer willing to support exactions which impoverished the kingdom. They computed the sum which had been paid for first fruits since the second year of Henry VII, £160,000 in less than 50 years, paid for lead and parchment, and they represented that the age and infirmity of many of the prelates rendered it likely that other large sums would be inveigled to Rome anon. The cases of bishops of York and Winchester, who had been obliged very lately to borrow money to pay for their bulls, to the great scandal of the nation, were related in both houses. All such payments were ordered to cease except £5 for every 100 of the yearly value of a bishopric, a considerable impost which, however, was not to be paid as annates, but for the writing and sealing of the bulls of the bishop-elect. If the Pope refused to send his bulls before annates were paid, then the consecration and installation of the bishop were to proceed without them. A bishop was to be consecrated by his archbishop, having first been nominated by the king, and an archbishop by two bishops to be appointed by the king, as in old times divers bishops and archbishops had been consecrated within the realm. If the king, it was ratified July 9, 1533. Serious date right there. In a few short months, Queen Elizabeth will be born. Anne has already been crowned. If the king failed to conciliate the Holy See, and the Pope laid the kingdom under an interdict, the efforts of his displeasure were to be disregarded altogether. But at the same time, it was emphatically declared that the king and his subjects remained obedient and Catholic subjects of the Holy Church. The bill was only a provisional regulation. Gentleness and courtesy were to be tried before extremity, and the royal assent to be delayed until the king had endeavored to bring the Pope to term. In this cautious and gradual manner, the great Roman cables cut away. It seemed indeed not improper for payments to be made out of the various realms of Christendom to remain competently the great chancellery of Christendom, and not unreasonable that these payments should come from those hierarchs who were bound above all others to uphold the Catholic system. But the exactions of Rome had become intolerable. New officials were created, and the levies of money increased continually. And the city of Julio and Leo shone as the glorious center of art and luxury, while the churches of the nations were impoverished to feed her splendor. The Council of Basel had reprobated the payment of annates. The clergy of England had, as we've seen, petitioned against them in the most outspoken manner. And now the English legislature, repeating much of the language of the clergy, seemed to be doing them great justice in putting a limit to an oppressive burden. But the griefs of inferiors are seldom remedied by a contest between their superiors. To the bishops, it would have made no difference if the act about annates had never passed. Their distresses were alleged, but their relief was never designed. While to the body of the clergy, the stirring of the question proved a more fruitful source of misery than anything else that was done in this age of spoliation. The term annates, first fruits, was suggestive. He's going to give the foreign history of the act. Was suggestive after a couple of sessions of Parliament, the first fruits not only of the bishoprics, which used to go to the Pope, but the first fruits of all the benefices whatsoever were transferred in one monstrous sweep to the crown. The foreign history of the bill is somewhat curious. The diplomatic efforts which Henry was engaged to make seem to have been directed rather to keep the pontiff in the dark than to conciliate him by showing the justice of what had been done. The king's ambassador at Rome were furnished with a copy of the bill, but they were ordered to keep it to themselves and by no means communicate it to others until some occasion should arise when it might produce an effect. If mention were made of the matter among the Pope and cardinals, they were to secure the king's position, assuring them that he had diligently procured all to be submitted to his own judgment and determination. They were to extol the friendship of the king towards the Holy See, which had led him to this course, and to assure them that now what is he's not seemed to be getting here, that Henry's pretty frustrated over the Campeggio Wolsey game and the failures of the see to respond to Cranmer and other legates. So this has also got a cloak and a dagger going on here, which he doesn't seem to be catching yet. The act only deals with the first fruits of bishoprics, not of all benefices, perhaps because the bishops got the first fruits which went to the Pope out of the clergy, as the priests got tithes out of the tithes of the Levites under the Mosaic law. And so the first fruits of all benefices were virtually included in those bishoprics, but I am not sure. Under Edward the first fruits of benefices were transferred to the crown for 2 years, all fruits, whatever went to the crown under Henry. If the Pope and cardinals complained that such a question as payment of annates had been brought forward and discussed, then the ambassadors were to say that discussion was free in the English Parliament and could not be hindered by the king, but that he had consulted both the justice of the case and his friendship for the Pope and cardinals in procuring that nothing should be done against them suddenly and immediately and without due warning, that he would preserve the tenor of the statute, examine its truth, consult justice, and regard friendship. The ambassadors were to allow the Pope and cardinals neither to hope too much nor to despair too much. Vain hope the king would not feed. Despair they need not feel, because nothing was decided or promulgated yet, but all was referred to him. If, however, they showed themselves disposed to doubt the protestations of so true a friend, and it might be represented to them how serious detriment it would be to Rome if the king should be driven to proclaim openly that which was done in secret, and by his example lead other princes of Christendom to make a similar edict for the abrogation of annates in their dominions. A good point. The agents of Henry, Ganucci, Benet, and Casale, were equal to the occasion. Perceiving that there was nothing said about annates in conversation at Rome, they thought it good to bring the matter up before the Pope themselves and give it the color which the king desired. They asked him, therefore, if he had any news from England. He answered his nuncio had informed him that something against the Apostolic See had been done in Parliament, but that he could not find out what it was. They answered that it was probably the abolition of annates, of which they had lately heard from the king, and went on to relate so much of the affair as their instructions allowed, setting forth the benignity, friendship, and justice of their master. The Pope expressed himself satisfied that the king had reserved the matter for his own discretion, and the ambassadors told him nothing further, lest they should irritate him to speak of it in the consistory, and it should come to the ears of the cardinals and damage the king's cause. That would be Anne. Thus the annates of English sees were lost to Rome, without exciting much attention there. But Rome had hardly time to notice the loss of English annates, for scarce a vacancy occurred for which they might have been demanded, before in the onward rush of the Revolution England was lost to Rome altogether. On the same day that the submission of the clergy was signed before the king, Sir Thomas More resigned the Great Seal. The liberal temper of the author of Utopia had given way to some severity under the pressure of the times, and some of the heretics who were disturbing the public peace had felt the weight of his office. But whether he outran the law against them, as it has been alleged, may be the subject of future inquiry. It is the effect of lengthened controversy to cause even men of large and genial nature to take their stand at length, and sense of public necessity may turn a philosopher and a wit into a stern official. Before he took office, More had learned that concessions never satisfy a revolution. He had been pursued by the hatred of the Anne Boleyn and her faction. They, with the king's connivance, had now carried matters to a point beyond which he conceived that he could neither interfere with effect nor yield with credit. The independence of the clergy under the jurisdiction of the Pope was gone, and in his apprehension at least, the jurisdiction and the primacy of the Pope was necessary for the avoiding of schisms. Foreseeing alteration without end, he resigned. His career as a minister was too short to be well compared with that of his predecessor. But so far as it went, it offers no uninstructive contrast. The sagacity of both enabled them to understand the full meaning of the revolution which they witnessed. They were both zealous reformers of the abuses of the old system which they defended. But while Wolsey was lenient and silent, More was severe, and to his severity as a minister, he added his power of ridicule as a writer. Not content with imprisoning the heretics, he laughed at them. In this he stands alone among the eminent supporters of the old learning. And to this he owes no small measure of the malignity with which his memory has been pursued. He, and he almost alone, showed that he understood the force of literary agitation and knew that libels which were circulated by thousands to change the mind of the people towards the clergy must be answered by their own fashion. When he was Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, he condescended to answer the atrocities of Simon Fish. When he became Lord Chancellor of England, he bent the wit which rivaled Erasmus to the confutation of Barnes and Tyndale. Far more than the prison or the stake, his enemies dreaded the caustic scorn which refuted their cavilitions, unmasked their motives, and not unfrequently exposed their characters. The boldest of them only uttered with bated breath the ready imputation that the champion was the hireling of the bishops. Strips, letters to Cromwell, Appendix 48. His spotless integrity was proved by the poverty into which he retired after innumerable opportunities of enriching himself amid the universal example of corruption. He continued to death the controversial warfare upon which he had entered. His retirement, like the disgrace of Wolsey, was the sign of a new change in the times. And his successor in his high office, Audley, was a man completely to the mind of the king, courtiers, and the party of progress. 3 months after this, at the age of 80 years and more, died William Warham, a man of virtue, ability, and eloquence. He had been at the head of the church almost from the beginning of this troubled century. The last public act in which he was engaged, the submission of the clergy, brought and before he died, he committed to writing a solemn protestation against any statutes hitherto published or thereafter to be made by Parliament in derogation of the Roman Pontiff and the Apostolic See, or in diminution of the ecclesiastic power or of the rights, privileges, customs, and liberties which belonged to the prerogative of his Church of Canterbury. We said Archbishop of Canterbury, Primate of all England, and Legate of the Apostolic See, protest publicly and expressly for ourselves and our Metropolitical Church of Canterbury that we cannot consent to such statutes. We dissent from them, cry out against them, contradict them. But this weak probation itself was the last instrument of an English primate who died legate of the Apostolic See. And when the hand that wrote it, stiff in death, but wearing still in funeral state the consecrated glove in which it had often been raised to celebrate the great mystery of the Catholic faith, was pressing to the yet unburied breast of the writer the golden cross of Canterbury, the proud dominion of 1,000 years was already gone forever. The scene was clearing for the new actors. The king had already sometime been possessed of his new minister and counselor in chief. He now got, within a few months of another, his new Lord Keeper, his new Archbishop, his new wife, his new father-in-law, and all that belonged to him. Now we move on to the next chapter, chapter 3, 1533 and 34. The business of the 2 following years was colored by the king's matter. 5 years had now rolled away since Henry first began to move for a divorce, and he seemed little nearer to the attainment of his wishes. At the beginning, therefore, of 1533, he broke the long suspense by secretly marrying Anne Boleyn, whom he had made Marchioness of Pembroke, granting her a yearly provision of £1,000 out of the revenues of the See of Durham. His wavering ally, the King of France, was informed of what he had done and undertook to keep the secret and to see and conciliate the Pope. But neither by the course of nature nor of policy could the fact remain concealed until the proposed interview between the Pope and French King had passed. The consequence of the marriage soon became apparent, and on Easter Eve the bride was ordered to receive the honors due to the consort of the Queen. The consequences of an appeal by a rightful queen against the bigamy were to be anticipated, and Parliament, meeting in February, passed the famous Act for restraining appeals to Rome. From this time, the negotiations of Europe involving the divorce became an intricate web of mutual distrust, indecision, and contempt. Concessions were made and withdrawn from England, France, and the Pope. Interviews were arranged but never passed or came to nothing. While on the other hand, behind the shifting clouds of foreign policy, the processes begun within the realm, both civil and ecclesiastical, moved steadily and swiftly toward the total abolition of the authority of Rome. The Act for the Restraint of Appeals has acquired and deserved the fame of being the first decisive blow struck by the English legislature against the power of the Pope. In the most important branch, it put an end to his authority altogether. Legislation hitherto both in this and former reigns had than to check and limit his authority. It was one thing to regulate the licenses of the Pope or to diminish the revenue which he drew out of the realm, but another to abolish his appellate jurisdiction within the realm. The former had been the object of law hitherto, from the statute of provisors to the statute against annates. And the statute against annates, the last of the kind, contained an explicit declaration that the king and his subjects remain still in the obedience to the Holy See. No such declaration will be found in the Act about Appeals, nor in the subsequent Act of Parliament. Henceforth, the object of legislation was not the limitation, but the destruction of papal power. But though the object and operation of the laws became different from what it had been, yet their nature and principle remained the same as they ever had been. The former laws had sought to remedy a mischief. The Act of Appeals and the great acts which followed it in separation of England from Rome sought to remedy the same mischief. But the one no less than by the other, the power of the Pope within the realm was treated as an usurpation, which on the one hand was suffered and on the other hand repudiated. Alike they spoke of it as an annoyance, an inquietation, and an inconvenience. Against it, both asserted the independence of the realm. The former laws held the Pope in check within the realm. The latter drove the Pope away. The latter, in the strenuousness of their action, asserted the independence of the realm by asserting formally the supremacy of the king formally. But this supremacy had always existed and was implied in every one of the former statutes. Within the realm, the king was always supreme, but the latter statutes, the statutes of the Reformation, which affirmed the supremacy of the king, never went on to deny the supremacy of the Pope, for the reason no such supremacy existed. They spoke of the annoyance which the prerogatives, liberties, and privileges of the crown, or in one word, the royal supremacy, had received at various times from the authority of the Pope, but they never acknowledged that the Pope had been supreme in England and that there was one supremacy impugning another. What the Pope had was not supremacy, but primacy, and they deprived him of whatever internal jurisdiction or authority he had acquired in the realm from his preeminence as the prime patriarch of Christendom. Having driven him out of the realm, they pursued him no further at first. They allowed his primacy to begin where the supremacy of the crown ended, or the supremacy of the crown to begin where his primacy was ended. The internal independence of the realm and of the Church of England as the realm and spiritual capacity was finally asserted. But it would be impossible to gather out of the various enactments in which this was now declared a single word to the effect that England denied the primacy of Rome. Regarded in the immediate object, the Act for Restraint of Appeals appears as a base aggravation of injury. Queen Catherine had married the king under a dispensation from the Pope, and all that had passed, the king's appeals, the trial, the negotiations, the height of cowardly barbarity, seemed to be reached when she was cut off from the right of appeal because the king had married another woman. The suit, yet impending, and the legal device by which the king covered his bigamy is of a piece with his inconsistent craft in punishing Wolsey for holding the Pope's commission after procuring it for him. But this miserable piece of retrospective legislation is nevertheless the great declaration of the internal independence of England, uttered in language worthy of the matter. It would be impossible to find a more admirable exposition of the constitution of the realm than that which is given in the preamble of this statute. The old imperial theory of the realm, that England is an empire, is renewed. The king is declared to be the supreme head of the realm, to whom the subjects owed obedience next to God. And the subjects compose the body politic, which is in one capacity termed the spirituality, in another the temporality, consisting of the people. Footnote: from the days of Athelstan, it is the observation of Mr. Freeman, the kings of the English assumed the title of Emperor of Britain, meaning thereby to assert the independence of the English crown upon any foreign superior, and also the dependence of all the other powers of Britain upon the English crown. It was meant to assert that the king of the English was not the homager, but the pure like of the Imperator of the West and of the Basileus of the East, big points. And it was meant to assert that the Scots, Welsh, and Cumbrians owed no duty to Rome or Byzantium, but only to their father and lord at Winchester, Norman conquest. It was meant, indeed, to assert that Britain was the third imperial division of the kingdom. That's insightful. To this theory, or rather to this important fact, the ecclesiastical division anciently agreed. The Britannic churches constituted a separate patriarchate. Archbishop Anselm received from the Pope at the Council of Bari the title of Pope, Papa Alterius Orbis, that is to say, Primate of the English Church, was acknowledged to be a patriarch, owning indeed the primacy, but not the supremacy of Rome, just as the Constantinopolitan patriarch owned the primacy, but not the supremacy of Rome. Under the king in either capacity by some proper officers, all laws, all cause of the law divine or of spiritual learning that arose within the realm were declared to have been determined hitherto, and still to be determined by the English church or spirituality, and all causes for property and goods, and for the preservation of peace, to be administered, adjudged, or executed by the ministers and judges. Another footnote: in divers sundry old authentic histories and chronicles, it is manifestly declared and expressed that this realm of England is an empire, and so hath been accepted in the world, governed by one supreme head and king, having the dignity and royal estate of the imperial crown of the same, unto whom a body politic composed of all sorts and degrees of people, divided in terms and by names of spirituality and temporality, have been bounden and owen to bear next to God, a natural and humble obedience. He also being instituted and furnished by the goodness and sufferance of Almighty God, with plenary, whole, and entire power, preeminence, authority, prerogative, jurisdiction, to render and yield justice and final determination to all manner of folk, residents, or subjects within his realm, in all causes, matters, debates, and contentions happening to occur, insurge, or begin, within the limits thereof, without restraint or provocation, or potentates, the whereof having power, when any new cause of law divine happened to come to question, he's the emperor. This is 24 Henry VIII. So this is 1533. It's very remarkable that in this important statute. So there we will call it for now. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost.